We're back on the Eastern Front today in the last years of World War II.
In the West,
There's no Germans right there in that little spot.
Of the
Ooh, they are trapped, they are trapped, they are trapped.
Destroy their units.
Good morning, everybody. I have my coffee. At least this morning here. I don't know what time it is where you are right now. Oh, and Roger says, hey. I'm actually kind of sad today because we're on our final video of this series we've been doing on the Eastern Front from the channel Eastery. I'm really glad that you guys suggested this series to me because I really hadn't studied the Eastern Front very much. In the United States anyway, they tend to put more of an emphasis on just the American involvement in World War II. After watching this series, I have a whole new appreciation for the Eastern Front, and I think it's kind of a shame that Americans aren't taught more about it because it's very apparent to me now that the Eastern Front was far bloodier, far worse than anything else in World War II. And of course, there's also all of the stuff going on in China that we haven't gotten into yet. I mean, China had the second biggest death toll after the Soviets. So that's something that I'm going to have to learn more about as well. We've had a big influx of new people to this channel over the past few days, and I just want to say, if you're new here, welcome. In addition to learning all of the British history and culture and everything, I am really into things like military history. If you've been around for a while, I do want to thank you for that. Thanks for commenting down below because you guys really do help me learn more about this stuff in the comments. And that's the point of this channel, is for me to broaden my horizons and learn new things. So on the last video I did about 1943 and 1944, we got a couple more stories from you guys of grandfathers fighting for the Soviet Union, either defending Leningrad or Moscow or Stalingrad. Those were really touching stories, and I really thank you for sharing them with all of us. I also had a question about the reconnaissance that went on, and a lot of you kind of confirmed what I suspected, was that there was a lot of aerial reconnaissance going on. They intercepted radio communications. The Enigma code had been broken as well, which all of that stuff is really fascinating to me. I do have a background in technology, and so the way that they use computers and code breaking is just super fascinating to me. I think we're going to have to do a video on that one. And some of you also mentioned that some of the POWs were a good intelligence source, but I think learning more about the reconnaissance sounds really interesting. So I don't know if there are any videos out there about reconnaissance and war, but if you know of any, let me know because I think I'd like to watch a couple of those. I was also wondering how far the front line actually was because it looks huge on this map. I think I found something online that said it was something like 1,800 miles, but I don't know if that's accurate or not. If so, that's just slightly larger than like north to south here in the United States, which is a huge area to defend. I also got some help from you guys kind of explaining what the X's were. 2 X's mean a division, 3 mean a corps, and 4 mean an army. One of you even sent like a little graphic explaining to me what each of those were. It looks to me that the thing that distinguishes those different categories is just the number of troops that are in each category. I have always wondered what the difference was between like a company and a division and a platoon. I've never been in the military, so I just don't know this. And I think also somebody said that the black circles on the German side might have meant the tank divisions and the gray ones meant infantry, or I might have that backwards, I'm not sure. Also, somebody mentioned in the comments in my last video that General Patton was put in charge of like a fake army division, and I think I remember seeing this in a movie or two about World War II. He was given like inflatable tanks and wooden equipment and fake soldiers. And I think that's just hilarious that they gave that to Patton because he has a reputation for being like one of the most hardcore generals ever. I would actually love to do a video on that, so I'm gonna have to keep that one in mind. But even though this is our last video on the Eastern Front, it's not going to be the only thing that we do on the Eastern Front. Obviously, this video series has sparked a lot of curiosity in me, and I really want to learn more about a lot of the individual battles, especially Stalingrad. We're definitely going to go back and visit Stalingrad and learn more about just that specific battle. I've also been learning a lot more about kind of the Russian culture and history in this, so we're going to get more into like the Russian history side of things and also German stuff as well. So before I start this video, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos that we're going to be doing kind of related to this. And also, I just need you guys to stick around because I need you to help me learn this stuff. Okay, enough talking, let's get into the video. You ready, Roger? He's been waiting a few days to get into this, so let's go ahead and do it.
Early summer 1944. The war had decisively turned against Germany. The Axis forces had been consistently pushed back, and both from east and west, the Allies were preparing to move into Germany.
Okay, so the Allies are
Allies
blue.
had gathered their forces to open the second front, and the Germans had prepared a large force to counter them. They intended to push the Western Allies into the sea and then concentrate again on the eastern front. There, the Raid Army had achieved a strong superiority and was hoping to finish the war in a two-stage operation. First, the German forces on the eastern front would have to be destroyed on their advanced positions without them being able to retreat into Germany. After the Axis forces had been severely weakened, the Red Army would advance into Germany and take over its resources to wage war. As the first step, Finland would be knocked out of the war. Then, the Red Army would encircle and destroy the German Army Group center. After that, the Soviet forces would advance towards the Vistula River and the Baltic, which would result in cutting off the Army Group North. The German forces would then be pushed into the sea and destroyed. Finally, an attack would be launched in the south in order to seize the Romanian oil fields. These operations would destroy most of the Axis military capabilities on the eastern front and clear the scene for an attack into Germany itself. Back in 1941, the Finns had seized forward defensive positions on the Soviet territory, and since then the northern part of the front hadn't seen much action. The Soviet plan entailed encircling the Finnish forces on their forward positions and then advancing into the depth of the country without much resistance. The first attack on the Karelian Isthmus pushed the Finnish forces back, but they were able to escape the encirclement and conducted an orderly retreat. The Soviets launched an offensive in the east, but here too the Finns were able to pull their forces back and deploy them on a new defensive line. By this time, the focus of the Red Army had changed to the central part of the front, and they couldn't spare forces for follow-up operations in Finland. Thus, armistice was signed in September, and Finland was able to leave the war with fewer concessions than could have been possible.
Oh, wow. Okay, so an armistice was signed. I don't know what the terms of that was, so Finland basically surrendered at that point, is what it sounds like. I was actually wondering how this was going to go, because a lot of you guys told me about the Winter War that the Soviets fought with Finland like right before World War II happened, and apparently the Soviets lost that. So I was wondering if the same thing was going to happen here, but no, it looks like the Soviets pulled it out this time.
With Finland leaving the war, the German presence in the north of the country became untenable. Using the rough terrain to their advantage, they conducted a stage-by-stage retreat and were able to evade the Finnish and Soviet pursuit, extracting their units into Norway. The Red Army didn't follow them, and the large-scale fighting in the north came to an end.
I guess that does make sense that they were up there, because Finland was allied with Germany. Anyway, I don't remember the Germans being all the way up in the northern part of Finland like that. Maybe they were up there in previous videos and I just don't quite remember it. He hasn't spent a whole lot of time on the northern part of this, so...
As the battles were raging in Finland, the Soviet forces were about to launch their attack in the center. Army Group Center could be attacked from the south and north of the Pripyat marshes, and Soviets had created two large concentrations of forces. The southern attack would be more dangerous for the Germans, and they directed all of their attention to that sector, thinking that the northern one was a ruse. This allowed the Soviets to achieve a total surprise.
The Soviets are really outnumbering the Germans on this one.
The German forces were forbidden to retreat, and many of their units were encircled near the original front. Their southern forces...
I do think it's right that Hitler got more and more desperate as the war went on. And so he started ordering his military to kind of do some questionable things. So I'm assuming that that's what happened here, is that he just ordered all of his soldiers to not retreat on the Eastern Front. It doesn't really sound like such a smart move, but I do understand if you're getting desperate and you feel like you're starting to get a little bit more closed in, then you don't want your troops retreating, but at the same time that makes them more vulnerable to capture. So I'm no military tactician, but it doesn't sound like a super smart thing to do.
Of the Army Group Center. The German forces were forbidden to retreat, and many of their units were encircled near the original front. Their southern forces were able to pull back further,
so you guess it
but
didn't
were
work,
also
right?
eventually trapped. The Red Army advanced towards Minsk with little opposition. The Germans were unable to pull their remaining forces back in time, and they were encircled east of Minsk. With half of the Army Group Center's strength being destroyed, the Red Army's advance continued. One opportunity to stop the Soviet advance was to pull back part of the Army Group North and counterattack at the flank of the advancing Soviet forces. Due to strategic considerations, Army Group North
100,000
stayed in
POWs.
its
These
position.
numbers are just
Instead,
still
it
blow
was
my
decided to
mind.
stop the Soviet advance by redeploying units from other sectors of the front. With their main focus in the west,
There's no Germans
there were
right
no
there in that
ready
little
reserves
spot
in the
by
east. It would take
Kaunas.
time before the Germans could gather a large enough force for other sectors of the eastern front. When the front had moved far enough west, the Soviet forces in the south joined the action. They had built up an especially strong concentration here, and the Germans were unable to stop it. After achieving a breakthrough, their force was divided into two. One of them was tasked with securing the beachhead over the Vistula River for a future offensive, and the other moved north in a flanking move against the Army Group Center.
I've heard the term bridgehead in some of these videos, and also I've read it before as well. You guys are gonna have to explain to me what a bridgehead is exactly. I mean, obviously it sounds like something that you either build or you secure a bridge going across a river.
Was tasked with securing the beachhead over the Vistula River for a future offensive, and the other moved north in a flanking move against the Army Group Center. The Germans had finally gathered a reserve force of armored units and could start patching up the front. There were two critical situations: the breakthrough on the southern flank of the Army Group Center and the large gap between Army Group Center and North. The Germans decided to first deal with the southern situation. As the Soviet forces neared Warsaw, Polish resistance launched an uprising in the city. However, the German armored forces arrived, blunted the Soviet spearhead, and the front was stabilized. Meanwhile, the Red Army had begun the destruction of the Army Group North. It exploited the gap between the Army Groups North and Center, and soon the Soviet forces established a narrow corridor to the sea, severing the land communications of the Army Group North. However, the Red Army didn't have the strength to push the Germans into the sea, and the Germans were able to trade land for time. This gave them time to...
He keeps saying pushing them into the sea. What does that mean practically? Does that mean that they just get backed up to the water and they have to surrender at that point? I'm assuming that's what that means. I'm also assuming that the Germans are not going to be sending boats to try and rescue these troops.
Germans were able to trade land for time. This gave them time to
redeploy
their armored reserves to the sector, and they counterattacked, re-establishing the land connection with the Army Group North. The Red Army now made a pause to gather sufficient strength for the final push. However, when their advance continued, the Germans were able to pull out of the salient.
They are trapped, they are trapped, they are trapped.
And destroy their units. It now switched its focus to the south and launched an attack towards the sea, catching the Germans off balance.
That's a really bad position to be in.
Cutting Army Group North off in Courland, but they were unable to finish the German forces off. The Soviet forces now extended their attack further south, but the Germans had had the time to re-establish a solid front and the offensive bogged down. October marked the end of the Red Army's summer campaign in the north and center. The Soviet forces now began a long preparation for the second phase of their plan, the invasion of Germany. During the Soviet
the Germans are more fortified though
heavy fighting
now.
was taking place on the western front. The Germans had deployed their forces along the French coast in anticipation of the Allied landings. With their forces spread out, their immediate coastal defenses in Normandy were unable to deny the Allies a beachhead. The Germans combined their troops for an effort to push the Allies into the sea. However, they ended up only having the strength to contain them. For most of June and July, both the Allies and the Germans deployed more and more forces to Normandy, but as the Germans had also to deal with the crisis on the eastern front, they were unable to allocate enough troops, and in August the Allies broke out of the beachhead. Part of the German forces were destroyed, and others had to conduct a quick withdrawal. With their troops disorganized, the Germans were unable to take advantage of the defensive river positions in northern France and could check the Allied advance only in the hilly terrain in front of the German border.
Look at that.
The Allies began preparations to carry their advance into Germany itself. As the Allied forces were breaking out of Normandy, the Soviets were about to begin the final part of the plan, an attack against the Army Group South. During the summer, more and more forces were diverted from the Army Group South in order to deal with the crisis in the center. Despite that, the Army Group had retained its forward deployment in front of the river lines. In late August, the Red Army launched its offensive on the southern part of the front. It took advantage of the vulnerable deployment of the Axis forces and managed to encircle part of them. Romania had long sought an opportunity to withdraw from the conflict. And now, when a large part of the German forces was neutralized, they made peace with the Allies and soon declared war on Germany. The Red Army now moved south.
Whoa, Romania. You know, I didn't even think about that part of it, where some of these countries that were, I guess, forced to fight for Germany because the Germans basically invaded them or threatened to invade them if they didn't help out. Suddenly, not only is Germany having to deal with the Western Front and the Eastern Front, but now they've got these nations that are turning on them, and that adds even more pressure. Question about this though, since Romania had been fighting with Germany, would they have any sort of intelligence on the Germans that they could hand over to the Soviets to help the offensive at all? Or is that something that the Germans just wouldn't have shared with them? I would imagine that that's also one of the ways that could be beneficial to the Allies.
South unopposed. The surviving Germans declared when a large part of the German forces was neutralized, they made peace with the Allies and soon declared war on Germany. The Red Army now moved south unopposed. The surviving German units attempted to re-establish the front in the Carpathian Mountains. However, the Red Army moved west along the plains to outflank them. As the Soviet units entered Bulgaria, this country too joined the war against Germany and began mobilizing its army. In the Carpathians,
so
the Germans
more
were now
countries
joined
turning
by
against
the
Germany at
Hungarian
this
army
point.
and attempted to re-establish a solid front along the mountain range. However, they didn't have enough time, and with the help of the Romanian units north of the mountains, the Red Army was able to cross the passes into the Hungarian plain with little opposition. Now the Axis presence in the mountains became a liability, and the Red Army attempted to cut off these forces with a two-pronged attack. The northern attack was unable to push through the mountains, and this allowed the Axis forces to concentrate on the southern Soviet spearhead and destroy it. This slowed the Red Army's advance enough for the Axis forces to withdraw their units from the salient in time. The defection of Bulgaria and the Soviet advance into Hungary threatened to cut off the German occupation force in Greece. This area wasn't considered important by the Red Army, and they decided to commit their limited resources to Hungary. This gave the Germans time to gather their units from the islands to the mainland, and soon they began their withdrawal from Greece. They were able to extract much of their units intact. Until the end of the war, the southernmost part of the Eastern Front was of secondary importance for the Red Army, and fighting there would be relegated to local formations. By October, the first phase of the Soviet plan was complete. They were able to deny the Axis the Romanian oil supplies, deal heavy damage to Army Group Center and South, and while they were unable to destroy the Army Group North, it was trapped in Courland.
I'm just looking at this map right now, and the German army is starting to look very, very close in. They're surrounded on both sides. It's starting to look a bit like a hopeless situation, and I can understand Hitler getting a little bit more desperate at this point. They've lost a lot of ground. Also, all of that fighting that just happened in the mountains on the southern part of this, how difficult is it to fight in that kind of terrain? I don't really know what the mountains are like in that part of the world, but I would imagine that having to go through mountain ranges makes it way, way, way more difficult.
Damage to Army Group Center and South, and while they were unable to destroy the Army Group North, it was trapped in Courland. Germany itself was now vulnerable to an invasion. The forces in the north would undertake large-scale preparations, while the units in Hungary were to continue their advance. The Soviet forces continued their push, but by that time the Axis had recovered from their prior disasters, and the Red Army's advance was checked between the Carpathians and the Danube. With the central front quieting down, the Germans began deploying more forces to Hungary. The Soviets were able to extend their southern flank further west over the Danube, but the progress in the north was far slower. Facing difficulties, the Red Army concentrated on a smaller objective, taking Budapest, where the Axis had deployed a large garrison. During December, the Soviet forces slowly moved to encircle the city, and after its communications with the main Axis front had been cut, began a costly operation to clear the city of the defenders. With the northern part of the front still quiet, the Germans had brought up reinforcements and attempted to re-establish the land connection with the Budapest garrison. In the following month, they achieved some progress, but were eventually unable to reach the city. In the last months of 1944, most of Soviet forces were preparing for an offensive into Germany, and the fronts were relatively quiet. The Germans misinterpreted this as a sign that the Red Army had exhausted itself.
So we have got the Soviets here with not quite 3 times as many men, but still vastly outnumbering the Germans. I don't really know what the numbers are on the Western Front at this point. Why was the southern part of this kind of more active and more important than the northern part? Because he just said that the northern part of the front was fairly quiet compared to the south. So is there some extra importance in the south here that I'm not quite getting?
As a sign that the Red Army had exhausted itself. They sent freed up forces west in their last hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Western Allies by encircling their forces in Belgium. However,
I'm sorry to keep pausing it, guys. I just have these questions. Bear with me. So we saw on the landings in Normandy that there were like 1.3 million Allied forces, and now there are like 229,000. What happened to the other ones? I mean, obviously I know some of them got killed and stuff. That just seems like a huge disparity in numbers to me.
Allies by encircling their forces in Belgium. However, the attack was fought to a standstill in the Battle of the Bulge, and the Western Allies began to push the Germans back.
We're gonna have to do something on that.
With their reserves used up, there was little that could be spared for the eventual battle for Germany, which now began on the Eastern Front. During the pause in the fighting, the Germans had an opportunity to evacuate their forces from Courland, but they decided to keep them there.
Okay, so they would
after the
maybe
Western
evacuate.
Allies had been defeated, they would be able to use the Courland position to conduct an encirclement. Now there wasn't much opportunity left to evacuate them. By mid-January, the Soviets were making final preparations for their massive attack in Poland. They had created 3 large concentrations of forces. The central force would advance directly towards Berlin, while the others would secure the flanks.
Men.
At the same time, the German forces in the East Prussia would be encircled and destroyed. The setup of the German troops in Poland was unfavorable, with their reserves expended and a lot of their forces deployed away from the main direction of the Soviet attack. The offensive began in mid-January. The weak German defense in the south and center was pushed aside and the Soviet troops advanced quickly. But the northern attack got bogged down in Prussia and was unable to advance. As a result, the central force outran the northern and its flank was becoming increasingly overextended.
Dude,
the Germans threw all of their forces east to halt the Soviet attack. After the Soviet forces had reached the Oder River in front of Berlin, they had to make a decision. Whether to keep moving towards the capital of the Reich immediately and risk encirclement from the flanks, or secure the flanks first and then continue the offensive from a better position. They decided for the latter option. With the Germans scrambling.
So I'm just looking at this really quickly here. So they are really on the outskirts of Berlin at this point, and there is a kind of a bulge right there, kind of going towards Berlin with the Soviets. I see one circle there on the German side that has the 5 in it. I don't really know what that is exactly, but that seems like a really, really small number of German soldiers between Berlin and the Soviets. How in the world did the Germans allow that to happen? To me, just to my untrained eye, it looks like the Soviets would have no trouble just kind of getting right past the Germans right there.
Scrambling their forces and the Soviet logistics extended, the operations proceeded in a slower pace. In February, the Soviets expanded
some
their
more,
flanks
it looks
to
like,
the
came
sea
out
in
of
the
Berlin,
north
maybe?
and to the mountains in the south, and pushed the German forces in Prussia into small pockets near the sea. This delay allowed the Germans to re-establish
a lot of
the
Germans
front
trapped
line
up there
before Berlin, and the Soviets would need more time to continue their advance west. Meanwhile, the Red Army had cleared Budapest and had made preparations to resume the offensive. By this time, the Germans had switched their focus back on the Eastern Front to defend the Reich. They had deployed a large force in front of Berlin, but Hungary was the last area where they could hope to conduct offensive warfare and had sent their last panzer forces there to conduct an encirclement. The Red Army had learned of their plan and had decided to let the Germans attack first before starting its own offensive. The Germans were too weak by this time to conduct even limited offensives, and soon their attack was absorbed by the Soviet defenses. The Red Army then attacked and pushed the Axis forces back, making them abandon all captured territory. The Axis resistance was soon greatly reduced, and the Soviet forces moved into Austria. After they had captured Vienna and secured their occupation zone in eastern Austria, the advance was stopped. With a large part of the German forces scrambled to the east, they lacked the troops to properly hold the Rhine river line. In
Wow.
mid-March, the Western Allies crossed the river in several places and moved into the German rear. They pinned most of their immobilized forces in place.
I just had a thought. He just said the Rhine River right here. Have you guys seen the movie Bridge over the River Kwai? Because I have. It's been a really long time since I've seen it, but I'm trying to remember where that actually took place. If you guys can remind me, I'm assuming it was on the Western Front and not the Eastern Front, because I think I remember either American or British soldiers in that movie, so that would assume the Western Front. Did that have to do with the Rhine River right here that he's talking about?
And then proceeded into the German rear. They pinned most of their immobilized forces in place and then proceeded with an encirclement of the German troops in the Ruhr area. Having neutralized a large part of the German forces, the Allies
Americans
spread out
doing that little
and moved
encirclement
through
movement.
North Germany almost unopposed. By mid-April,
Wow,
their
the
forces
German. Oh
had
my
reached the
gosh,
Elbe
there's
River,
no
a
Germans
line
on that
dividing
side
the areas
of the Western Front.
responsibility of the Red Army and the Western
Wow.
Allies. At the same time, the Red Army destroyed
So on the Western Front, it looks right there like the Americans, it looks like it was just the American troops right there. They basically just pummeled the German army and had a free ride to Berlin, it looked like. So was that the case? Was it Berlin was very vulnerable on the west side at this point?
destroyed most of the German forces left on the Prussian coast and deployed the freed up units to the Berlin direction. In the middle of April, the offensive was launched. The Red Army wanted to avoid costly urban combat in the city and moved
Okay.
directly towards Berlin, encircling the capital.
Oh
Most
my
of the German
gosh.
forces were
Yeah, the
left
Germans are
outside
done
the
at this
city.
point.
Hitler
They're
then
done.
ordered them to move into Berlin, but they were too weak and were only able
They're
to
done.
fight their way out west. Thus, the Red Army was able to clear Berlin only in about 10 days. Soon the Soviet forces made contact with the Western Allies.
10 days,
By that
wow.
time, Germany had lost most of its territory, and with the loss of the capital, the last Axis
Yeah.
forces on the Eastern Front were to surrender soon. In the last operation of the Soviet-German War, the
Just
Soviet
give up
forces cut
at
off
this
the
point.
path west of the German forces in Czechoslovakia and secured their surrender to the Red Army. During this time, the general German surrender was declared, and soon after that, the last remaining pockets of Axis resistance in Europe were liquidated. With that, World War II in Europe ended, and so do the series on the Eastern Front. We would like to thank our patrons for making these videos.
Well, that's it, guys. I am actually really kind of sad that we're leaving this series behind. That was so good. So I actually didn't know that it was the Soviets that took over Berlin, it looked like, in that. So that's kind of cool. I mean, they deserve it. After all that they went through on the Eastern Front, they were the ones that deserved to take Berlin for sure and kind of get that satisfaction. I'm sure that there were some troops from the Western Front that got into Berlin as well and kind of helped them out. But yeah, at the end there, I don't think I've ever seen a live map representation of World War II before. Everything else I've seen in the past have been more like documentary style, and they just don't show maps like that. And this gave me such a really great like bird's eye view overview of exactly the entire European theater and what happened. Now, obviously this is very condensed and it skipped over a lot of details. It gives you just a much better understanding of everything. So I really thank you guys for recommending this video series. We're going to get into another series. I think what I would like to do is, because I've had so many different series recommended to me on different topics, I'd like to probably keep a series going all the time, maybe every other video. We're also going to keep up the World War II stuff. I've had a lot of requests for the German soldier remembers World War II and like the memoirs. I think it would be really fascinating to hear the other side of things. I mean, you have to remember that in this war, yes, we were fighting against an enemy and we didn't necessarily agree with that enemy, but I think a lot of the soldiers, even on the German side, they were just forced to fight. They didn't necessarily want to. And just watching this, my mind just keeps going to what it would have been like on the ground for these soldiers. I mean, if it had been me and I was in a situation where I had been trapped, encircled, trapped against the sea, whatever, I would have been freaking out because there's no guarantee of getting out of that situation. And it just had to have been so scary and horrible. And also just for the civilians too. I mean, I can't even imagine being a civilian in World War II where there was a lot of fighting, because it just must have been hellish to go through. I think it's important to keep in mind that even though I really love learning about military tactics, and I think wars are fascinating to study. You do have to keep in mind that these were real people in these situations, and war is never pretty, it's never good, even though it's necessary sometimes. It's just got to be like one of the worst experiences a human being can go through. So on that happy note, we'll wrap up this video. I really appreciate you guys watching and subscribing, commenting below. Please do comment below and answer my questions if you can. I've really enjoyed learning from you guys. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe. We've got more coming your way. So as always, stay tuned and we'll see you next time.